Look at the big political developments of the day. Joining us live now is political consultant Jim Middleton. Jim, always good to see you. Thank you for your time. We've just heard a Republican's view from Utah on the problems of climate change. We heard from our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, on this morning. The PM insisting Australia is doing its bit to tackle climate change, pointing out that we'll meet and beat, in his words, our current targets. But the world is going to be looking at us in Glasgow and expecting more ambitious targets and firmer plans for action.
Indeed. Good afternoon to you, Ash, and to your viewers. Look, Australia may have been doing its bit, but I think the message from the IPCC's latest report is we all need to be doing a bit more. Now, watching the Prime Minister's news conference a short while ago, he seemed to be indicating that, yes, Australia would get beyond its commitment to get to 26 or 28% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. But is that 30% or 33% or 35%? But the IPCC report says that even that is not enough. The other thing was that I noticed that there was no clear answer in questions put to him by members of the press gallery about the question of the Nationals under Barnaby Joyce, under the new or renewed leadership of Barnaby Joyce. Barnaby Joyce has said there's zero chance recently of the National Party room agreeing to a 2050 target of net zero emissions, and there was no answer on that question, and also no answer to the question about modelling that he was trumpeting that was coming down the pipe from Treasury about the costs of action on climate change, but no answer to the question of what would be the cost of inaction. That is, what cost would be imposed on Australia and on Australian businesses, not by taxation, but by the actions of other countries, that is of the European Union, for example, imposing border tariffs whereby there'd be taxation on products that came from Australia into the EU, those taxes and the revenue from those taxes going to EU countries, rather than if there were a cost on carbon emissions here, which would go into the Australian government's revenue. So it seemed to me it rather left more questions open than it answered.
Yeah, to the other global crisis, the COVID situation, your home state of Victoria seems to be in a pretty tenuous position in Melbourne. Things are increasingly dire, as we've seen in New South Wales today. Probably broadly, it's unsurprising to see poll results suggesting Scott Morrison's personal standing is suffering as a result.
Certainly is, and it would seem too, it can't be far off where we'll see some kind of reaction to Gladys Berejiklian too, on two fronts, those who think she's not doing enough and those who think she's doing too much, given all the rhetoric about gold standard, et cetera, that we saw for a long time. The interesting thing about what she's saying now is this notion, and keeps on saying, about the Delta variant being different. Well, yes, that is the case, but we knew it was different when the New South Wales outbreak occurred somewhat 7 or 8 weeks ago. We knew it was different then. If it was different then, if it was more virulent then, why not have taken the stronger steps initially rather than waiting around now and still having this argument about whether or not the lockdown should have been stronger and should be stronger, and what measures should be firmer rather than not. I was intrigued watching a little earlier Kerry Chan addressing those questions being in the New South Wales parliamentary inquiry. She noted, for example, she skirted around the question about whether she had ever recommended firmer measures than were introduced at the time. She said there were a range of options that were given to the Berejiklian government. And the other thing, which I think you noted a moment or two ago, that she had made no recommendations. There were no options offered up to the government in terms of what happened come the end of August, and on this notion of maybe easing a bit if you get to 50% of the New South Wales population, or 50% of those over the age of 18 having been vaccinated. So it seems that the Premier is a bit on her own as far as that is concerned. It seems to be walking back a bit on what that might mean. In any event, it might mean something closer to what happened here in Victoria towards the end of earlier lockdowns, where we saw a bit of easing, and indeed I'm a bit of the beneficiary of that right now, living outside metropolitan Melbourne, and conditions have eased to some degree here, whereas they have not yet in Melbourne. So maybe it's something like that. But the fundamental question is this: if you know and you knew back in June that the Delta variant was much more virulent, much more dangerous, why didn't you step in firmer, more quickly than the Berejiklian government has done so far?
Yeah, I know. Our political editor, Andrew Clennell, has been watching that inquiry in New South Wales Parliament pretty closely, and he'll be giving us a full wrap shortly on afternoon agenda. So more on that to come. Jim, always appreciate your analysis. Thank you.
My pleasure, Ash.